nobody's listening in on a conversation at that point, is just determining whether or not, if, for example, we found a phone number in Osama bin Laden's compound after the raid, had he called anybody in New York or Berlin or any place else? If, in fact, we discover that another call has been made, at that point, in order to listen to any phone call, we would have to then go to a judge and seek information through a process that is court supervised. And this entire thing has been set up under the supervision of a federal court judge. When it comes to the internet and email, as Chancellor Merkel said, we're now in an internet age, and we have to make sure that our administrative rules and our protections catch up with this new cyber world. What I can say to everybody in Germany and everybody around the world is this applies very narrowly to leads that we have obtained on issues related to terrorism or proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. So there are a few narrow categories. We get very specific leads. And based on those leads, again, with court supervision and oversight, we are able then to access information. This is not a situation in which we are rifling through the ordinary emails of German citizens or American citizens or French citizens or anybody else. This is not a situation where we simply go into the internet and start searching any way that we want. This is a circumscribed, narrow system directed at us being able to protect our people, and all of it is done under the oversight of the courts. And as a consequence, we've saved lives. We know of at least 50 threats that have been averted because of this information, not just in the United States, but in some cases threats here in Germany. So lives have been saved. And the encroachment on privacy has been strictly limited by a court-approved process to relate to these particular categories. Having said all that, what I've said in the United States is what I shared with Chancellor Merkel. And that is that we do have to strike a balance. And we do have to be cautious about how our governments are operating when it comes to intelligence. And so this is a debate that I welcome. What we're going to be doing when I get back home is trying to find ways to declassify further some of these programs without completely compromising their effectiveness, sharing that information with the public, and also our intelligence teams are directed to work very closely with our German intelligence counterparts so that they have clarity and assurance that they're not being abused. But I think one of the things that separates us from some other governments is that we welcome these debates. That's what a democracy is about. And I'm confident that we can strike this right balance, keep our people safe, but also preserve our civil liberties, even in this internet age.
Ja, ich kann für die deutsche
Well, for the German people, I can only say the following. It's important, it's necessary for us to debate these issues. People have concerns, precisely concerns that there may be some kind of blanket across the board gathering of information. We talked about this, the questions that we have not yet perhaps satisfactorily addressed, we will do address later on, but there needs to be a balance, there needs to be a proportionality, obviously, between upholding security and safety of our people in our country and privacy lines. There are quite a lot of instances where we were getting very important information from the United States, for example, the so-called Sauerland Group. And at the same time, obviously, people want to use those new modern means of communication and technology and do so freely. And as we learn to live and deal responsibly with other new means of technology, we have to learn and deal responsibly with this one. And I think today was an important first step in the right direction, and I think it has brought us forward. Madam Chancellor, Mr. President, first a question addressed to you, Mr. President. There were a number of hopes in the world that were in a way shattered as regards your legislative term, for example, the closing down of Guantanamo or scrapping the death penalty throughout the whole of the United States and all of the states. Now, as regards Asia, and are you singling out Germany because there's a big risk here? And Madam Chancellor, the Nobel Prize winner, Obama, is waging a drone war also via Germany, and is he allowed to do that according to German law?
Let me see if I understood your question properly. First question was related to policies back home, related to Guantanamo or the death penalty, and then you wanted to talk about drones, or did you just want to focus on the drone question? I just want to make sure that I'm responsive to your question.
I guess I ought to answer on the drones, and Guantanamo, that was a question I believe addressed to you.
It continues to be my policy that I want to close Guantanamo. It has been more difficult than I had hoped, in part because there's been significant resistance from Congress on this, and on some issues I need congressional authorization. But about a month ago I gave a speech in which I said that I would redouble my efforts to do so, because 9/11 happened, and we now have been involved in one form or another in a war for over a decade. One war, I think, in Afghanistan was necessary. One war I disagreed with strongly. But in either case, there are dangers if we get on a perpetual war footing. The threat of terrorism remains real, and we have to be vigilant, and we have to take steps to protect ourselves, consistent with our values and consistent with international law. But we also have to guard against being so driven by fear that we are not changing the fabric of our society in ways that we don't intend and do not want for the future. I think closing Guantanamo is an example of us getting out of that perpetual war mentality. Some of the people at Guantanamo are dangerous. Some of them did bad things. But we cannot have a permanent outpost in which they're being held, even as we're ending a war in Afghanistan that triggered some of these, the capture of some of these detainees in the first place. So I'm confident that we can continue to make progress on this front, although you're right, it has not been as fast as I would have liked. One of the things you discover as a politician is that people don't always do exactly what you want. It's shocking. And then you have to keep on working at it. One thing with respect to drone policy, in that speech that I gave, I also addressed that issue of the lethal targeting of identified terrorists. This also is a source of controversy. We have constrained it tightly, and as we defeat Al-Qaeda, we have to, I think, very carefully examine how these technologies are used. I can say, though, that we do not use Germany as a launching point for unmanned drones to go after as part of our counterterrorism activities. And so I know that there have been some reports here in Germany that might be the case. That is not.
Ich möchte dazu ergänzen, dass
Let me
die
compliment by
Vereinigten
saying
Staaten von
that
Amerika
the United States of America
hier haben, Soldaten
have
hier haben, dass,
bases here, they have soldiers here, they fulfill a very important function, particularly in the fight against terrorism. If I think of Ramstein, for example, and also supplies to soldiers, but also caring for wounded soldiers. We, as allies, as members of NATO, stand shoulder to shoulder here, and we provide bases for our activities, and our work is based also on shared values. As I said, we have exchanges on values, but I think it's good. I think it's the right thing to do for the United States of America to be present here with military bases in Germany. It's a normal thing within an alliance, and this is as it should be and as it will be and continue to be.
Thank you. Mr. President, on Syria, for the purposes of transparency, can you be specific about what military arms the United States will be providing to Syrian rebels and about which groups will be receiving them? And on the same subject, President Putin appeared resolute and isolated on Syria at the G8. How can a political process succeed in bringing peace if Russia continues to support Assad both militarily and politically? Merkel, wenn ich meine Frage auf Deutsch stellen darf. Die Bundesregierung hat immer argumentiert,
the federal government has always argued along the lines that weapons exports and deliveries with supplies would always lead to an escalation because they could land in the hands of terrorists. Don't you think that the situation is going to be exacerbated if America supplies it? Perhaps you would also comment on Mr. Putin. Thank you.
Well, first of all, Jeff, I'm very impressed with your German. And I don't know if you had to practice, but you sounded great. Chancellor Merkel said you were just okay. I cannot and will not comment on specifics around our programs related to the Syrian opposition. What I can say is that we have had a steady, consistent policy, which is we want a Syria that is peaceful, non-sectarian, democratic, legitimate, tolerant, and that is our overriding goal. We want to end the bloodshed. We want to make sure that chemical weapons are not used and that chemical weapons do not fall into the hands of people who would be willing to use them. And so we've had a consistent view in our desired outcome in Syria. It's also been our view that the best way to get there is through a political transition. And we said that a year ago, we said that 2 years ago. President Assad made a different decision and has brought chaos and bloodshed to his country and has been killing his own people. And it is our view that it is not possible for him to regain legitimacy after over 100,000 people have been killed and millions have been displaced inside the country. So the question now is just as a practical matter, and this is what I said to President Putin, as a practical matter, if in fact Syria is to remain a unified country and the bloodshed is going to end, how do we do that? The only way to do that is through some sort of political transition process. And the good news out of the G8 meeting is that you saw all the countries, including Russia, reaffirming the communique coming out of the first Geneva talks that said we need to create a transitional governing body with full powers. The second good thing that came out of the G8 discussions was that all of us, including Russia, said we have to investigate use of chemical weapons inside of Syria, and all the parties, including the government of Bashar al-Assad, have to cooperate with that investigation. We're confident that, in fact, the government has used chemical weapons. The Russians are skeptical. We said, fine, let's have the United Nations get in there, but do a serious investigation of it, because we don't want anybody using chemical weapons. Now, the issue for us is how can we continue to support a political opposition and a military opposition that becomes more capable, becomes more unified, that isolates extremists who have incorporated themselves into the opposition forces inside of Syria, so that if, in fact, and when we get a political transition, there's somebody there who can take over and function in governing and lead to a better future for all Syrians. That's a difficult process. It's not one that's happening overnight. But all the assistance that we are providing, both to the political and military opposition, is designed for that purpose. Some of the stories that have been out there publicly have, I think, gotten a little overcranked in terms of the idea that somehow the United States is preparing to go all in and participate in another war. What we want to do is end a war, but the only way it's going to end is if, in fact, we have the kind of transition that I described. And although you're right that at this point President Putin believes that what would replace Assad would be worse than Assad himself, what I think will become more and more apparent over the coming weeks and months is that without a different government, you can't bring peace, and in fact you're going to see sectarian divisions get worse and worse and start spilling over into the other parts of the region, and that would be good for nobody.
Zu der Frage der Waffenlieferungen.
On the issue of arms supplies, Germany has very clear, strict rules on this, legal rules, according to which we are not allowed to supply arms into areas where there is civil strife, and that is not specifically designed for the Syrian question. It is a general rule, but that does not mean that we do not wish and can play a constructive role as regards the political processes, for example, as regards humanitarian assistance, as regards also the debate on which is the right way to go about this. How can we strengthen the opposition, those forces that work in the best interest of the people in Syria on the ground? And the situation is somewhat vague as regards the members of the opposition and quite different. It is our task also, as we see it, that those who wish for a good future for Syria, who are not linked with terrorists, get a chance to achieve full legitimacy, because Germany too is of the opinion that Assad has certainly lost that legitimacy. The Russian president, as I understand him, says not so clearly what I said just now, that the Syrian president, namely, has lost his legitimacy, but we have found common language in the sense that we wish to work for a transition government. And the question also has to be asked, what is going to come after that? And that is a question we need to address, and we did so. And in the language of the communique of the G8, it says, we all of us reject terrorist forces in Syria because they would again exacerbate the suffering and of the people there. now we have to see to it that step by step all of these different strands are brought together, because unfortunately as yet there is no common UN position, because Russia so far was not on the side of the others. But we must leave no stone unturned in trying, as we did during the G8, to find a common basis on which we can also speak with Russia. And there are certain areas where we obviously differ. But our political responsibility is to time and again seek to bring this matter forward in the right direction. And since the situation, if we look to Jordan, if we look to other countries in the vicinity, becomes more and more unstable, what with the flow of refugees and all, I think it's worth every effort to try, all of us, to try to do something based on the language of the communique of yesterday, to do something in the interest of the people in Syria.
Mr. President, in the past there were some different points of view about the best way out of the global financial crisis. And Chancellor Merkel stands for a policy of cutting back budgets to reach a status of financial stability throughout the Eurozone, to win back trust of the markets. Did you talk about this issue, and what's your position on that? Frau Bundeskanzlerin, gleiche Frage auch an Sie. Hat es eine Rolle gespielt, die Situation in der Eurozone?
Same question addressed to you. Has there been a discussion on the Eurozone, and do you wish to abide by the policy that you, in view of the problems that the countries in the South have currently? Maybe I ought to start with something that, because your question insinuates something that we don't want. We want prosperity, we want competitiveness, we want economic strength in order to bring about reduction of unemployment. We talked about this at some length, and I also said Germany in the long run will only be able to live well if Europe as a whole is doing well. So it would be a very wrong tack for our policy to take if we were pursuing a kind of policy where we weaken those countries into which we, after all, wish to export our goods. I think the world is changing, however, and Europe is not competitiveness enough in all areas. The budget consolidation is one piece of the mosaic. Structural reforms have to come into this. The Italian Prime Minister addressed this issue at some length during the G8. What does this mean for young people? What does it mean for jobs for young people? But still, the task is, if 90% of growth globally is generated outside of Europe, then we need to produce goods that are so competitive for other markets to actually buy them. And this is something that we need to undergo. We need to draw down red tape, bureaucracy. We need to be more open for research and development. We need to have structural reforms. We need to have, for example, affordable energy. If I look at the energy price development in the United States, all of this needs to be done. And part and parcel of that also is, particularly in a continent that is growing ever older, that we are able to reduce our budget deficits so that we don't live at the expense of future generations. That is what this is all about. This is what I am fervently asking for and working for. Europe can only help that is strong, and so a future without Europe is something that I cannot envisage for Germany. It's two sides of one and the same coin. On the one hand, Germany needs and wants to be competitive, and we also want others to be competitive and improve their competitiveness, and we all belong together. This is why we showed solidarity time and again, and this is too something that we addressed.
Well, as Angela said, all of us want the same thing. We want to have an economy that is growing, where people, if they're willing to work hard, are able to succeed and can find jobs that pay a living wage and can retire with some dignity and can send their children to good schools and have health care that is affordable. And we have to do all those things in a way that's fiscally prudent so that we're not mortgaging our future or burdening our children and our grandchildren. And I think all developing countries, or all more developed countries, have been going through some of the same challenges. And we just went through the worst recession in many years. The good news is that we've seen some progress. In the United States, we fixed our banks, which was the source initially, the trigger for some of these major problems. We have a much stronger banking system now with much tighter supervision. The housing market's begun to recover. We've now grown for close to 4 years, 3.5 years, and we've created 7 million new jobs. But we still have some reforms that we have to do. We've got to improve the skills of our workforce. We've got to improve our infrastructure. We have to continue to invest in research and development. In all countries around the world, you're seeing growing inequality. And so we have to find ways to make sure that ladders of opportunity exist for those at the bottom, and that profits and increased productivity all does not just benefit those at the top. And so what's true in the United States is also true in Europe. Europe has different sets of problems. Part of the challenge of the Eurozone is that you have countries at different of productivity and are further or less far along on this path of restructuring and reform. So we've been discussing this. This has been a 4-year conversation that we've been having, and I don't think there's a perfect recipe. All of us have to make sure that our budgets are not out of control. All of us have to undergo structural reforms to adapt to a new and highly competitive economy. What's true is, though, all of us also have to focus on growth, and we have to make sure that in pursuit of our longer-term policies, whether it's fiscal consolidation or reforms of our overly rigid labor markets or pension reforms, that we don't lose sight of our main goal, which is to make lives of people better. And if, for example, we start seeing youth unemployment go too high, then at some point we've got to modulate our approach to ensure that we don't just lose a generation who may never recover in terms of their careers. And that's the struggle that I think all of us are going through. That's the discussion we had in the G8. That's the discussion that Angela and I had here today. I'm confident that Germany will succeed in this process. I'm confident that Chancellor Merkel cares about maintaining the Eurozone and the European project. And she, I think, is confident that the United States wants to do everything we can to get Europe through this difficult patch so that it can be a force for growth and prosperity well into the future. All right? Thank you very much, everybody.
Dankeschön.
Dankeschön.
And we have a photo here.